The cold came early that year in Shenandoah County. A brittle November wind scraped across the hills and slipped under the doorway of the Veterans Heritage Museum, a modest brick building nestled off Main Street, quiet as a chapel and just as sacred to those who remembered. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air carried that distinct scent of old paper, floor polish, and rusted brass, the past preserved in silence. There was no fanfare, no trumpets, just glass cases lined with photographs that had long since faded, uniforms that no longer fit the bodies they once armored, and stories told on plaques that most visitors skimmed. At 9:04 a.m., the front door swung open with a soft jingle. Walter Briggs stood on the threshold, tall, if slightly stooped, in his wool overcoat and a worn olive-drab field jacket beneath it. He moved slowly, but not because of age alone. His right leg dragged ever so slightly, the result of shrapnel near to Nong that never quite healed right. In his left hand, he carried nothing but a navy blue cap folded in two. No cameras, no bags, just memory. He nodded politely at the young woman behind the desk, a temp hired for the week, and made his way down the hall. The 101st Airborne patch on his sleeve was nearly threadbare, the stitching more ghost than symbol. It caught the eye of no one. "Excuse me, sir," a voice called, halting him mid-step. Walter turned. The clerk stood up from her chair, glancing nervously at the laminated schedule in her hands. "Are you with the reenactment group? Because visiting hours for unaffiliated guests don't start till 10. Walter blinked slowly. "No reenactments," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Just here to see some names." She hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "We have school groups coming." A second voice joined, sharper, younger. A security guard, barely 30, approached with brisk steps and a clipboard tucked under one arm. He was new. Walter didn't recognize him. "Sir, I'll need to ask you to step outside for a moment while we verify." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Walter replied, already moving toward the wall of honor, a brass-plated display at the far end of the corridor. His hand reached out, as it had every year, to touch the name carved on the third row, Raymond J. Nolan, Kia, 1968. The security guard followed. "I'm sorry, but this area is closed until—" Then it happened. Walter turned, slowly, deliberately, and with a motion that was neither aggressive nor proud. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The 101st Eagle patch slipped into view, faded, frayed, but unmistakable. There was a silence that followed, not loud, but heavy, like the stillness of a flag at half-mast. And then, from across the lobby, a voice broke the moment. "Sergeant Briggs." Everyone turned. A tall man in full dress blues, medals glinting subtly on his chest, stepped forward. He was older, perhaps late 50s, with silver at his temples and a calm, commanding gait. His eyes didn't settle on the security guard. They didn't question the clerk. They looked straight into Walter's, with recognition not just of face, but of sacrifice. The man removed his cap. "I know that patch. My father told me about you." Walter didn't speak. He didn't have to. The general did. He said you stayed behind to hold the beam when the roof gave in, that you dragged him out from under it before the ammo blew. You were 19. The clerk's clipboard slipped from her hands. The security guard took a step back. The general turned. "This man doesn't need a pass. This museum stands because of men like him." For a moment, no one moved. Then the general extended his arm and walked Walter, gently, respectfully, down the corridor. Behind them, silence remained. But it was no longer ignorance. It was shame. They sat in the War Stories room. Just two chairs, a table with an American flag folded on it, and the echoes of years long past. "You knew Ray?" Walter finally said, voice hoarse with something that hadn't been spoken aloud in a long time. "My father didn't just know him," the general replied. "Ray Nolan saved his life. And so did you." Walter nodded once, slowly. "He had a baby on the way. Never met her." The general's voice softened. "That baby was my sister. She named her first son after you." Walter exhaled, and for the first time in a long time, his breath trembled. They spoke for nearly an hour. About things most people wouldn't understand. Not just about firefights and helicopters, but about silence. About the years that followed. The ones that came without parades, where heroes unloaded delivery trucks and fixed broken plumbing, and were called Sir Less and Old Man More. At some point, the museum director arrived, red-faced, apologetic, but Walter simply waved it off. "Let the kid learn," he said. "It's better he did it now than never." By noon, word had spread. A few older vets had shown up, not out of schedule, but because someone had made a call. They stood in quiet formation down the hallway. Not in uniform, not in fanfare, but in dignity. One brought coffee. One brought a folded photo of their old platoon. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Walter stood with them, not apart from them. And when a young mother with her son passed by and asked softly, "Were you in the war?" Walter bent to eye level with the boy and said, "We all were. Some of us just never came home all the way." The mother teared up. The boy saluted. No one told him how. At 3:17 p.m., as Walter prepared to leave, the general stopped him. "There's something else," he said. "We're planning a dedication next spring. A new wing. The Raymond Nolan Room. I want her name on the plaque." Walter shook his head gently. "Raise the hero." The general met his eyes. So are those who remember him. For the first time in years, Walter's eyes glistened. But he didn't cry, because men like him didn't need tears to show emotion. They stood straighter. They breathed deeper. And they carried memory like others carry medals. Outside, the sun had dipped behind a ridge. Shadows lengthened across the parking lot. Walter Briggs stepped out, his breath catching in the wind, not from cold, but from something warmer he hadn't felt in years. Not attention, but recognition. Real, quiet, long overdue recognition. The door to the museum clicked shut behind them, sealing the moment into stillness. Walter Briggs stood there in the War Stories room, unsure what to make of the general's words. The last 20 minutes had turned from routine to reverence, from mistaken identity to unspoken honor. Yet even now, even after the general's salute, a part of Walter still didn't believe he belonged in the spotlight. He'd spent too many years in the shadows to feel at home under direct light. General Colin Garrison, tall and composed, motioned gently toward a chair beside the folded flag table. "Sit with me for a moment, Sergeant," he said. Walter nodded. The title felt strange after all these years, like trying on a uniform 2 sizes too small. But in that moment, it fit where it mattered most. They sat, not as a general and a former sergeant, but as 2 men carrying memory like sacred weight. Colin Garrison looked at Walter, not with pity or even admiration, but with something rarer, understanding. "My father talked about you more than he talked about the war itself," he said. "Said you were a mechanic who shouldn't have been on the front line, that you fixed more than engines." Walter gave a short breath. "I was just trying to get the radio van running when the mortar hit." "Just trying," Colin echoed. Funny how often history is written by men who are just trying to do their job. Walter ran a hand over his cap, eyes resting on the floor. "I didn't know who your father was. Not really. Never met him after the war. He didn't forget you. That story, the bunker, the beam," he told it like a bedtime legend. But it wasn't bedtime for him. He couldn't sleep most nights. Walter closed his eyes just for a second. Hugh City came back like smoke through broken glass. Sounds, dust, screams. "It was bad," Walter murmured. "We were in the wrong place. No one expected the roof to give. You stayed. I was scared. You stayed." Walter looked up. He had a photo in his wallet. A little girl. Blonde. "That's my sister. She still keeps that photo in her kitchen." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the things that couldn't be said and didn't need to be. At 10:15 a.m., the War Stories room door opened again. A museum staffer stepped in, hesitated, and looked at the general. "Sir, we have a school group from Stone Ridge waiting for the guided tour." Colin stood. "Then give them the tour of their lives." The staffer blinked. "Sir," the general turned to Walter. "Would you be willing to speak? Just for a few minutes." Walter froze. "I don't do speeches. Not a speech. Just be present." They need to see what service looks like when it's no longer in uniform. They didn't gather the children into rows. They didn't roll out a projector or dim the lights. Instead, Colin brought the group into the central corridor, a place where the air held the breath of decades, and stood beside Walter. "This is Sergeant Walter Briggs," he said. "He served in Vietnam, saved lives, fixed what was broken, and came home to live quietly among you." The students, mostly middle schoolers in jackets too big and shoes too loud, stared. Some fidgeted. One boy raised his hand. "Did you win any medals?" Walter looked down at the boy, freckles on his nose, wide eyes that didn't know the weight behind the question. "No," he said softly. "Most of us didn't, but we tried not to leave anyone behind." The boy didn't understand. Not yet, but one day he might. After the students left, something changed. Word had spread beyond the museum. Veterans from neighboring counties began showing up. Some in jeans and trucker hats, some in jackets still bearing old patches. One brought a harmonica. Another brought silence and nothing else. They came not for ceremony, but for confirmation that what they lived through mattered. That someone remembered. One man, George Teal, a Navy medic from the Tet Offensive, walked up to Walter with a trembling lip and said, "I thought I was the only one who remembered what the rain smelled like in '68. Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't." By mid-afternoon, the museum had seen more veterans than it had all week. Someone lit a candle in the small chapel room. Someone else brought in a box of old letters. The general sat quietly, letting it all happen, not directing, not managing, just witnessing. And in a quiet hallway near the back, where the museum's maintenance closet had been forgotten for years, someone found an old wooden display panel, dusty, cracked. On it was a single nameplate, Walter Briggs, 101st Airborne, Vietnam, 1968 to 69. It had been part of an old exhibit that was taken down when the museum was remodeled. No one had meant to discard it. It was just lost in the shuffle. Now it was carefully polished and mounted again, this time at eye level. When Walter saw it, he didn't speak. His fingers hovered over the engraving, tracing it not to admire, but to remember who he was when it had first been placed there. At 5:12 p.m., the museum prepared to close. But the crowd outside, growing, told a different story. Local news had picked it up. Veteran nearly ejected, then honored by general. Read the scrolling headline on phones and iPads. People from town gathered on the steps, not to protest, not to demand, but to witness. And then, the general did something unexpected. He asked Walter to come outside. The sun was setting now, casting long amber streaks across the brick plaza. Leaves fell like soft punctuation. The flag atop the museum rippled in the wind, half lit by the last warmth of the day. Colin Garrison stood beside Walter and raised a microphone. No podium, no stage. "My father would have stood here if he could," he said. "But since he can't, I will." He turned to Walter. "When I was a boy, I thought heroes looked like statues. Big, shiny, untouchable. But the man who saved my father's life was none of those things. He was just a soldier, a mechanic, a man who stayed." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They stood. Because some moments don't ask for applause. They ask for stillness. Colin extended a single hand. And Walter, hesitant, humbled, deeply moved, took it. The general raised it once, solemnly, and the crowd did the only thing that felt right. They saluted. Every one of them, veterans and civilians, kids and elders, strangers and neighbors. Some raised fingers to brows. Some raised hands to hearts. But all of them recognized him now. Later, as the crowd began to disperse and the chill crept back in, Walter stood near the steps, hands buried in his coat. A boy from a school group approached, the one who had asked about medals. This time, he didn't ask questions. He just reached into his backpack and pulled out a crayon drawing. It showed a soldier standing under a tree next to a museum. The soldier had gray hair and kind eyes. At the bottom, it said, "Thank you for not leaving." Walter took the paper. His hand shook just a little, and for the first time in a long, long time, Walter Briggs smiled. Not because he had been remembered, but because silence had finally been replaced by truth. And that truth had a voice. The days that followed felt different in Mill Creek. Not louder, not showier, just different, like the stillness that settles in a room after someone finally tells the truth. People moved the same way through their daily routines, but there was a new undercurrent in the air. A weight, perhaps, or maybe a memory. Walter Briggs noticed it first on the Monday after the museum event. He walked his usual path, down Maple, past the old barber shop, across the corner near the post office, heading toward the bench outside the Veterans Heritage Museum. The same bench he'd been asked to vacate just a week earlier. But now, something glinted from its wooden slat. A small brass plate, polished and new. The engraving was simple, reserved for SGT. Walter Briggs, 101st Airborne, still standing. Walter paused, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and restraint. He reached out, traced the letters with his fingers. No ceremony, no trumpet, just a seat, finally made sacred by acknowledgement. He sat, for a long time, and people noticed. It started small. A man walking his dog slowed to nod. A teenager on a skateboard rolled past, then circled back and offered a soft "Thank you, sir." A mother with a stroller stopped in front of him, as if about to ask for directions, but instead handed him a folded note from her son. "He saw you on the news," she said. "Wrote this last night." Walter waited until she left before opening it. Inside, "Dear veteran, I didn't know about you. Now I do. Thank you for still being here. From Kevin, age 9. Walter folded the letter and placed it inside the same jacket pocket that once held morphine ampoules and MRE crackers. That pocket had carried pain before. Today, it carried a seed of grace. By Thursday, the diner on 5th and Oak, Mabel's Griddle, where Walter had taken the same window booth for over 20 years, changed its rhythm too. The usual server, Janine, brought him his coffee and pie, but her hands weren't rushed this time. She stood for a moment, unsure. "I should have known," she said quietly. "I've seen that patch on your jacket 100 times. I just never asked." Walter looked up at her, kind but plain-spoken. "Not your fault. I still should have asked." She placed a small folded card next to the pie. "From the staff," she added before moving off. Inside, it read, "To the man who sat in quiet dignity while the world forgot. We see you now." The reckoning didn't roar. It whispered. That's how healing begins. Not with parades, but with permission to feel shame and choose better. At the high school across town, history teacher Mr. Dalton showed the local news clip in class. He paused the video on the image of Walter sitting outside the museum, hand resting on the brass plate. "What do you see here?" he asked. A dozen hands shot up. Most gave answers about veterans, respect, war stories. But one girl, red hair, braces, eyes like she'd seen something adults hadn't, said this. "I see someone who didn't stop showing up, even when no one saw him." Dalton nodded. He didn't press further. He didn't have to. That afternoon, a pile of handwritten letters arrived at the museum front desk, addressed to Walter Briggs. Then came Veterans Day. For decades, the town assembly had been the same. A flag raising at the courthouse, a reading of names, a band playing a slightly out-of-tune rendition of taps. Most students came for the early dismissal. Most adults came because it was tradition. But this year, something shifted. Walter had declined every speaking invitation for decades. He never considered himself the type to stand behind a podium. His battles weren't won on stages. They were won in foxholes and factories, in hospital waiting rooms, and lonely nights with flashbacks nobody else could see. But when the principal called this time, she didn't ask for a speech. She asked for a story. And for the first time, Walter said yes. The high school gym smelled like fresh varnish and teenage sweat, like any gym in any small American town. The bleachers creaked under the weight of students in bright hoodies and varsity jackets, restless and unaware of what was coming. Walter walked to the center mat with quiet steps, hands tucked behind his back. No notes, no microphone, just presence. He waited, and then, in a voice that sounded like worn gravel and rain-soaked leaves, he spoke. "I wasn't much older than some of you when I was drafted. 19. Thought I'd go fix radios and come home." He paused. A basketball rolled gently from the edge of the bleachers and was quickly stilled by a teacher. "They didn't tell us about the quiet, or the nights, or how you carry things back in your bones that no X-ray ever shows." The room quieted. I came home, but not all the way. For years, I sat on a bench outside the museum. just to remember my friend Ray. I wasn't looking for medals or attention, just a moment to say his name out loud, even if no one heard it. A breath. Last week, they called me a nuisance. He let the words land. I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I just kept showing up, even when no one noticed, especially then. Now, not even the teachers moved. Respect doesn't come from salutes or plaques. It comes from choosing, every day, to see people who've been invisible too long. And if you're lucky, from choosing to be someone worth remembering. He gave a small nod and walked off the mat. Not a single hand clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because the silence was heavier than any applause. Later that night, the video of his talk made its way online. Within hours, it had spread across the state. Within days, across the country. He didn't give a speech. He told a truth. The quietest man in the room said the loudest thing I've heard all year. Still showing up. Still standing. Messages came from other veterans. From families. From teachers. From grandchildren who had never asked their grandfathers about the war but now would. The town, without planning to, began to change. The mural on the side of the mill, once a fading emblem of a forgotten battlefield, was restored. It now included a figure in a field jacket, his back to the wall, one hand resting on a nameplate. The local library created a program called Seat Beside a Soldier, inviting veterans to come in and read to children each Saturday morning. Walter went the first week. Not to read, just to listen. And the diner? They renamed his window seat Briggs Corner. Not in fanfare, just in thanks. One Sunday, Colin Garrison returned. Not in dress blues this time, just jeans and a worn jacket. He met Walter outside the museum, both of them watching a father lift his daughter to read the brass plaque on the bench. "You changed something," Colin said quietly. Walter shook his head. "I just sat still." Colin smiled. "Sometimes that's what it takes to move a town." They sat together, two generations bound not by blood, but by memory. Walter turned, voice low. "You're not done, are you?" Colin leaned forward. "No, there's more coming." And indeed, there was. Because what began as a dismissal had become something far more enduring, a reckoning. Not with rage, not with blame, but with realization. That respect is not a day on a calendar. It's a coffee brought with care. The child's crayon drawing handed without prompting. The silence that falls when a story finally gets told. And the choice to see, every day, those who never stopped showing up, especially when no one noticed. It had been 2 weeks since the Veterans Day Assembly. Walter Briggs walked slower these days, not from weakness, but from something else, as if every step carried weight that others had only recently begun to notice. Not the kind of weight that wore a man down, but the kind that reminded him to pause, to see, to feel. The leaves had turned on the courthouse lawn, their color fading into that last stretch of gold before the branches stood bare. November in Mill Creek didn't roar in. It arrived quietly, like Walter himself, on the back of a cold wind and the memory of seasons past. He hadn't changed anything about his routine. Still visited the bench at 9. Still read the same morning paper, even though most headlines blurred together now. Still ordered coffee and cherry pie from Mabel's Griddle on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But everything around him had changed. When Walter entered the museum that morning, something was different. No signing clipboard, no security glance, just a silence that acknowledged, not questioned, his presence. And as he moved down the corridor toward the Wall of Honor, he noticed a new plaque, mounted beneath the names he'd traced with his fingertips for decades. It wasn't flashy, no backlight, no gilded frame, just brushed bronze and black letters. For the ones who didn't need applause, just a seat and a little dignity. He stood there longer than he meant to, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he didn't need to say anything at all. Later that afternoon, the young security guard returned. He wasn't in uniform this time. Instead, he wore a simple flannel shirt and brought with him a man in his late 50s, walking with a cane and wearing a Desert Storm cap. His father. They didn't ask to be introduced, didn't request a photo. They simply walked up to Walter, stood with him under the plaque, and extended their hands. First the father, then the son. Walter shook both, one at a time, firm and steady. The older man said, "I served as a combat medic in '91. My boy told me what happened here last month. Just wanted to say thank you for staying visible. Walter's reply was as quiet as ever. Thank you for raising a boy who came back. They didn't linger. No scene, just a moment. And then they were gone, leaving behind only a faint warmth in the room and the quiet scuff of boots on tile. At the diner the next morning, Walter sat in his usual corner booth. The coffee arrived hot, the pie sweet and tart. Nothing fancy, but under the plate sat a folded piece of paper. Not a bill, not a receipt. It was a note. In neat cursive, it read, "You carried more than a rifle. You carried memory." Walter read it 3 times before folding it carefully into his jacket. He didn't know who left it. Didn't ask. Some gifts are too sacred for questions. That same week, as he passed the elementary school on his way home, a boy on a bike, maybe 10, maybe 12, skidded to a stop on the sidewalk. "You're Mr. Briggs, right?" the boy called out, cheeks pink from the cold. Walter nodded. "My granddad says you're the reason he joined. Said he used to sit near you at the park bench when he was a kid and never knew who you were. So when he found out, it made him want to be better." Walter lifted a hand and tipped his hat. That was all. The boy grinned and sped off. That too was enough. Walter never asked for this. He didn't want a statue. Didn't want a holiday named after him. He'd buried too many men to believe in monuments. But somehow, over the course of a month, without ever giving a single order, he had become something more powerful than a leader. He had become a memory people chose to carry forward. At church on Sunday, a retired pastor pulled Walter aside after service. "Funny," he said, "how long you sat in that pew behind mine. Years. And I never really saw you." Walter gave a small smile. "You see what you're taught to look for." The pastor nodded. "And now I teach different. Mill Creek wasn't perfect. It still had its blind spots, still moved too fast, still forgot people in quiet corners sometimes. But now, the town had a touchstone. A man who had always been there in silence. A reminder that legacy doesn't require a title. Sometimes it's just a man still standing, still showing up, still remembering what others forget." Walter didn't change the world, but he changed a town. And that might just be the most lasting kind of change there is. In today's world, where loud voices often drown out the quiet and flashy headlines eclipse the steady lives of everyday people, the story of Walter Briggs stands as a gentle but powerful reminder. There are those among us who carry history, memory, and dignity without ever asking for recognition. Walter didn't need a statue. He didn't ask for a parade. All he ever wanted was a bench, a place to sit, to remember, and to quietly do what was right. And it took years, decades, even, for one small moment of misunderstanding to awaken an entire town to what they had overlooked. But once they saw him, truly saw him, they didn't just apologize. They changed. They learned to look again, to listen, to live with a deeper sense of gratitude. That's the lesson we carry into our present. In every neighborhood, every building, every gas station and diner, there might be a Walter, someone who served, who sacrificed, who has quietly been forgotten. They don't need statues either, but they do deserve to be seen, to be greeted with kindness, to hear a sincere thank you, to be acknowledged not with grand speeches, but with daily acts of respect, a seat offered, a line not cut, a glance that says, "I see you." More than that, Walter's story reminds us of the quiet power of simply showing up, even when no one's watching. In our work, our homes, our communities, sometimes just being there with consistency and quiet strength plants the seeds for change. It's not always the loudest gesture that makes the biggest difference. Sometimes it's the person who never stops sitting on a bench, remembering, honoring, waiting, that transforms a town. So the next time you step out your door, or see an older man sitting alone in a park, or a veteran silently waiting in line at the grocery store, pause for a moment. Nod, say hello, or simply carry the awareness that you're sharing space with someone who once protected the very freedom you now live within. Walter Briggs never asked us to do anything extraordinary. He simply reminded us, some people are still here, and they deserve to be seen.